I remember the sound of our living room clock more clearly than my father's voice. It ticked with the patience of something eternal, echoing through our narrow house like a reminder that time was moving, even when love wasn't. The house sat at the edge of a forgotten town called Meadow Ridge, wrapped in fields of pale wheat that whispered secrets to the wind. I grew up there, in a house where the curtains always stayed half-closed and the walls carried the scent of varnished wood and old disappointment. My parents weren't cruel, not in the way stories usually tell it. They didn't shout, didn't hit, didn't abandon. Their neglect was quieter, colder, the kind that smiled politely while freezing you out of warmth. When I brought home my first art contest ribbon at 10 years old, my father, Robert Ward, barely looked up from the newspaper. "That's nice," he said, his voice flat, the same tone he used when commenting on the weather. My mother, Mara, smiled that small, distracted smile that never reached her eyes. That night, I hung the ribbon on my wall by myself. It fluttered whenever the wind slipped through the cracks of my window, a quiet applause that belonged only to me. I learned early that in our house, silence was safer than celebration. There's something cruel about being a child who wants to shine in a home that prefers shadows. When I was 12, I built a small wooden horse in my father's workshop. It was uneven, a little clumsy. The legs weren't perfectly aligned, but I'd spend hours sanding it, painting it, giving it life. I placed it on the table when he came home, hoping maybe this time he'd notice. He looked at it once, adjusted his glasses, and said, "The back leg's off. You should measure better next time. No praise. Just precision." That was the moment I realized I could master every skill in the world, but I would never master their love. My mother wasn't much better. She loved appearances, tidy rooms, polite words, perfect manners. When I tried to talk about dreams or feelings, she'd pat my hand like a nurse calming a patient and say, "Don't overthink, Elias. Some things aren't meant to be talked about." So I stopped talking, and by 16, I became an expert in being invisible, the quiet boy with calloused hands and 1,000 unspoken words burning behind his ribs. I left Meadow Ridge the summer I turned 19. I told my parents I'd been offered a scholarship in the city. My father nodded, my mother packed sandwiches, and that was that. No tearful goodbye, no promise to write. When the bus pulled out of town, I watched the golden fields disappear in the distance, feeling something sharp twist in my chest. Not sadness exactly, but a hollow space where sadness should have been. In the city, I became a furniture designer. It started small, one internship, then another, but over the years I found success. Awards, clients, interviews. My work was known for its soul, they said. "You make furniture that feels alive." I smiled when people said that, though I knew the truth. Everything I built came from the ache of trying to be seen. Every curve of wood, every polished edge, every perfect detail was a plea. "Do you see me now?" It was a gray Thursday when the call came. "Elias," said the voice on the other end. It was Mara, softer, shakier than I remembered. "It's your father. He's not well. He's asking for you," I froze. I hadn't heard that voice in over 8 years. "I don't think," I began, but she cut me off. "Please, Eli, just come home." For a moment, I considered hanging up. But something in her tone, maybe fear, maybe guilt, anchored me. That night, I sat in my apartment, the city lights flickering through the window, and realized I had no idea what home even meant anymore. The road back to Meadow Ridge hadn't changed. The same sagging barns, the same roadside diner, the same smell of pine and earth after rain. But everything looked smaller, like the town had shrunk to fit inside my memory. When I pulled up to the house, it was exactly as I'd left it. Wooden porch, chipped paint, curtains still drawn halfway. Even the air inside felt preserved, thick with dust and time. "Eli," my mother whispered when she saw me. She looked older, hair silvered, hands trembling slightly. "Thank you for coming. My father was in the living room, the same one where silence used to live. Now it was filled with machines and soft beeping. He looked frail, sunken, a man carved out of regret. His eyes met mine. "You came," he rasped. I wanted to say, "You didn't," but I swallowed the words. The days that followed were heavy with unsaid things. I fixed the creaking floorboards, cooked dinners my mother barely touched, listened to the quiet hum of medical equipment while my father dozed in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he'd wake and look at me, not with anger, but with something that looked like sorrow. "I should have told you I was proud," he said once, voice trembling. But I didn't know how. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But old wounds don't heal from a single apology. One night I found an old box in his study. Inside were newspaper clippings, interviews of me, my work, awards. My father had cut them out, carefully folded them, and kept them hidden away. That night I cried for the first time in years. Not because of anger, but because love had been there all along, too broken to show its face. As my father's condition worsened, I started reading to him, old woodworking manuals, the kind he used to study. Sometimes he'd smile faintly, whispering comments about technique or material. It wasn't much, but it was ours. On his last morning, he reached for my hand. "You built things that'll last longer than I ever did," he said. That's all I ever wanted. And then he was gone. I sat there for a long time, holding his hand, feeling the warmth fade, thinking about every moment we never shared, and somehow, in the quiet, I felt a strange peace. Months later, I returned to the city, but something had changed. In my workshop, I began carving again, not for clients, not for applause, but for myself. The first piece I made was a wooden clock, simple, honest, imperfect. I placed it on my shelf, and when it ticked, it didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like forgiveness. When I left Meadow Ridge, the sky was a dull gray, not quite rain, not quite sun, the kind of sky that makes you question whether the world is mourning or just indifferent. I remember the bus stop at the edge of town, how the gravel crunched beneath my boots, how the air smelled faintly of cedar and gasoline. My mother had packed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, stacked neatly in a brown bag like a peace offering no one knew how to give. She stood beside me, her hands folded in front of her. My father waited in the truck, engine running, eyes fixed straight ahead. "You'll do well, Elias," she said softly, eyes flicking to the horizon instead of my face. I nodded, the word thanks stuck somewhere in my throat. The bus pulled up with a hiss, brakes screeching against the still morning air. I climbed aboard without looking back, at least. I told myself I didn't, but when I sat down by the window, I caught sight of her reflection, standing small against the expanse of the road, one hand lifted in a hesitant wave. My father never got out of the truck. The bus rolled forward, and Meadow Ridge shrank into memory. The city was the opposite of everything I'd ever known. Where Meadow Ridge was quiet and sprawling, the city pulsed, alive, loud, endless. People moved fast, spoke fast, lived fast. I spent the first few nights in a cramped apartment with a broken radiator, the kind of place that smelled like rust and survival. At first, I loved the anonymity. Nobody cared who my father was. Nobody measured me against the silence I'd grown up in. I took classes during the day and worked nights at a small carpentry shop run by an old man named Mr. Hanley. He was gruff, but his hands were steady, and he treated wood like something sacred. "You listen to it," he told me once, running his fingers along a plank of maple. "It'll tell you what it wants to become." No one had ever talked about creation like that before, not as perfection, but as understanding. For the first time, I felt seen without needing to prove anything. When the other apprentices went home, I'd stay behind, sanding and shaping scraps into something beautiful. Sometimes I'd hum, a habit from childhood I didn't know I'd kept, and the rhythm of the tools would echo like a heartbeat. Still, there were nights when I'd sit by the window, watching city lights shimmer across glass towers, and wonder if my parents ever thought about me. I tried to write to them once. The letter began with, "I'm doing well," and ended with, "I hope you're proud of me." But the words in between never came out right. What could I possibly say? That I'd made friends? That I'd built my first piece of furniture that didn't fall apart? That sometimes I still dreamed of the living room clock ticking in the dark? The letter sat on my desk for a week before I tore it up. Love shouldn't have to beg for attention. Years passed like that, one project leading to another, one client to the next. I began designing furniture for galleries, for people with money and taste who said things like, "It feels alive, Mr. Ward," and yet every compliment slid off me like rain. I built tables that could outlive me, chairs that could hold generations, cabinets that whispered of legacy. But inside, I was hollow. I went on dates that never became relationships. I laughed at parties and felt lonelier afterward. The applause I got from strangers never reached the place inside me that still waited for my parents' eyes to soften, their voices to say my name with pride. Success, I learned, is the most beautiful kind of emptiness. It fills your hands but not your heart. The night I realized how lost I'd become, it was raining. I'd just opened my first solo exhibition, a showcase of my designs titled Echoes of Home. People wandered through the gallery murmuring praise, glasses of wine in hand, their reflections glittering off varnished wood. Every piece I'd made carried something of Meadow Ridge, the curves of wheat stalks, the simplicity of old furniture, the warmth of cedar. A reporter asked, "What inspired this collection?" And I said the only truth I could: silence. They laughed, thinking I was being poetic, but I wasn't. When the evening ended and the crowd thinned, I stood alone among my creations, a room full of beauty that couldn't love me back. I thought about calling home that night, just to hear their voices, but then I imagined my father's tone, polite and distant, and I let the thought die quietly. It would be years before the phone finally rang. By then I'd learned to live with the ache, the dull companion of unhealed wounds. I told myself the past didn't matter, that I was my own man, that the child who needed love had long been buried. But grief has a strange way of waking the dead parts of you. When my mother called and said, "Your father's asking for you," it was as if time folded in on itself. Suddenly I was that boy again, standing in the living room with a wooden horse in his hands, waiting for approval that never came. The sound of her voice cracked through years of silence. "Elias," she whispered. "He's not the same." Neither was I. Driving back to Meadow Ridge felt like traveling through my own ghost story. Every tree, every fence post, every familiar curve in the road carried a whisper of who I'd been. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe confrontation, maybe closure. But what I found was something quieter. Two old people trying to make peace with the wreckage they'd built. My father's illness had taken his strength, but not his pride. My mother's eyes were tired, but finally open. And me? I was somewhere between resentment and forgiveness, like a man standing at the doorway between the past and the future, unsure which way to step. Looking back now, I think my real escape wasn't the bus that took me from Meadow Ridge. It was the walls I built around myself afterward. Walls made of ambition, precision, discipline, all the tools I learned from him, but those walls kept more out than they kept safe. It took my father's fading breath to realize that sometimes love doesn't look like tenderness. Sometimes it's just a box of newspaper clippings hidden in a drawer waiting to be found too late. I used to think my parents never loved me. Now I think they just didn't know how. The road back to Meadow Ridge looked the same, but I didn't. The fields were still there, tall, golden, bending under the whisper of wind. But they didn't seem endless anymore. Maybe I'd grown too big for them, or maybe I'd just learned to see the boundaries they'd always had. I hadn't been home in almost 9 years. 9 years of noise, ambition, and trying to outrun the echoes of my own childhood. And now here I was, a grown man with calloused hands and a hollow chest, turning onto the same dirt road where I'd once waited for the school bus with a lunchbox and too many unasked questions. My mother's voice from the call still lingered in my mind. "He's asking for you." Those words felt heavier than any burden I'd carried. The house stood just as I remembered. Weathered siding, peeling paint, the porch swing still hanging by a single chain. The steps creaked beneath my boots, and for a moment I half expected the door to open on its own, to hear her voice call my name. It didn't. I knocked once, then again. Finally, the door opened and my mother stood there. She looked smaller than memory, her shoulders drawn inward, gray streaking through her hair, her eyes cautious but searching. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached out, her hand trembling slightly. Eli, hearing that name again, the one only she used, hit something deep inside me. I didn't know whether to hug her or turn away. I did neither. I just nodded and stepped inside. The air in the house smelled the same. Lemon polish, dust, and something faintly metallic. The scent of age and waiting. Every creak of the floorboards echoed with ghosts. "He's in the living room," she said softly. "He doesn't move around much anymore." The living room. The same room where I'd once stood with a wooden horse in my hands, waiting for approval that never came. I could almost hear the ticking of the clock again. Patient, eternal, cruel. He was sitting in his old armchair, a blanket draped over his knees, an oxygen tube resting beneath his nose. When I entered, he turned his head, slowly, with the stiffness of someone whose body no longer listened to him, and our eyes met. For a long time, neither of us said a word. Then he managed. "You came." His voice was a whisper of what it once was, cracked, fragile, but still carrying that unmistakable edge of control. "I did," I said. My own voice felt foreign here. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." I hesitated before lowering myself into it. The silence between us was suffocating. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other. It was the heavy, brittle kind that came from years of words left unsaid. "You look older," he said finally. "So do you," I replied. Before I could stop myself, a ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. Fair. And then, quiet again. I studied him while he caught his breath. His face had thinned, his eyes sunken yet alert. The hands that once shaped wood and barked orders now trembled as they rested on the armrest. Once I'd feared those hands. Now I pitied them. My mother brought in tea, setting it on the small table between us. "I'll give you both some time," she murmured, retreating to the kitchen. The clink of the teacups filled the air. I picked mine up, if only to have something to do with my hands. Finally, he spoke again. "I read about your exhibition," he said, his eyes fixed on the cup. "The one called Echoes of Home." I stiffened. "You saw that?" He nodded. "Your mother keeps clippings. She told you about it?" "She didn't need to." His gaze met mine. I kept my own. The words hit harder than I expected. I'd imagined indifference, not quiet pride hidden behind years of silence. "Why?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Why never say anything? You knew I was trying, like, that I wanted—" I trailed off, ashamed of how childish the sentence sounded. He looked down, rubbing his thumb along the handle of his cup. "I thought you didn't need it." "I did," I said, the words sharp, rising before I could contain them. "I needed it more than anything." His shoulders sagged. "And I didn't know how." He took a long, shallow breath. "My father never told me he was proud either. I thought, maybe that's just how men are. You do your work, you provide, you don't talk about feelings. I thought if I gave you a roof and food, that was enough. It wasn't. I see that now." The sound of the old clock ticking filled the space between us. Steady. Unforgiving. He went on, "When you left, I thought you were angry." But part of me was proud too. "You had courage. You did what I never did. You left. I stared at him, unsure whether to cry or scream. Why didn't you say that then? He gave a small, helpless laugh. Because pride's a stubborn thing, Elias. It's like a splinter under the skin. It hurts, but you can't admit it's there. I leaned back, exhaling. For the first time, I saw him not as the man who failed me, but as the boy he used to be, maybe raised in the same silence he'd passed on to me. Generations of unspoken love, repeating like an old song no one knew how to end. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I found my mother sitting by the kitchen window, staring into the dark. The soft hum of crickets filled the air. I used to think he didn't care, she said without looking at me. But he did in his way. He just never learned to show it. I sat beside her. And you? Did you? She turned her gaze to me, her eyes glassy. I was scared. You were so bright, Eli, so full of dreams. I didn't want to see you get hurt the way I did when mine faded. So I tried to keep you small, safe. Her voice broke. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself. I didn't know what to say. The weight of her confession settled between us like dust. Sometimes, truth doesn't free you right away. It just shows you the shape of the cage you've been living in. The next morning, my father handed me a folded piece of paper. I wrote this a while ago, he said. Didn't know if I'd ever get to give it to you. Inside, in his uneven handwriting, were just a few lines. Elias, if silence was my mistake, then let this be my noise. I am proud of you. Always was. I just didn't know how to say it without feeling small. Love, Dad. I read it 3 times, the words blurring as tears stung my eyes. All those years I thought I'd been running from them. But maybe I'd been running toward this, toward the moment where the silence finally broke. That afternoon we sat on the porch. The wind carried the scent of wheat and rain, and for the first time it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like memory breathing again. He looked out over the fields. You built a good life, he said softly. I tried. You did more than I did. I shook my head. You gave me the tools, he smiled faintly. Maybe. I just wish I'd given you words too. We didn't say I forgive you. We didn't need to. Sometimes forgiveness isn't spoken. It's the quiet between 2 people who finally understand each other. Nights in Meadow Ridge have their own kind of silence. The city hum I'd lived with for years was gone. In its place came the breathing of the house, the low groan of beams adjusting, the occasional rattle of the porch swing when the wind turned. I slept in my old room again, though sleep wasn't the right word. I drifted somewhere between dreaming and remembering. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face in the glow of the bedside lamp, that tired half-smile that had tried to say everything words never did. The 3rd evening after my return, I found my mother in the hallway, a candle in her hand. The power had flickered earlier. Now the house swam in orange light. I couldn't sleep, she said. Me neither. She nodded toward the living room. He's still awake. Sometimes the medicine makes him restless. The shadows stretched long across the floor as we walked in. My father was propped against pillows, the blanket drawn high on his chest. He looked smaller than ever, but his eyes followed the flame as if the light itself were a story he wanted to hear. You remember, he murmured, when the power went out during that winter storm. You built a fort out of blankets and made us sit inside it. I laughed quietly. You told me it was a fire hazard, he smiled. I was wrong about a lot of things. The words hung there. My mother's eyes flicked to him, then to me. For the first time in years, it felt as though all 3 of us were in the same conversation instead of orbiting separate silences. Later that night, she led me upstairs. There's something I want you to see. Her sewing room smelled of cedar and lavender. She opened the top drawer of her old desk and pulled out a box tied with ribbon. Inside were photographs, sepia-toned, edges curled. My parents as a young couple, laughing in a field, his arm around her shoulders. I don't remember him ever looking that Free, I said. He wasn't always the man you knew, she answered. He wanted to travel. Wanted to make furniture by hand, sell it in fairs. Then his father died and the shop needed him. Everything after that became about responsibility. She brushed her thumb across one photo, tracing his younger face. He buried his dreams before you were born. I think he wanted to keep you from feeling that same disappointment. And you? I wanted to be a teacher. She gave a small laugh. But Meadow Ridge didn't have much use for women who wanted things back then. We sat on the floor, surrounded by ghosts who looked like people we might have known if life had been kinder. The candle burned low, the wax running down like time refusing to stop for any of us. The next morning, while fixing a loose hinge in the hallway cabinet, I found another box wedged behind the drawers. Inside were letters, some addressed to me, none ever sent. Most were short, proud of you today. I wish I'd said more before you left. The house feels too quiet without your noise. They were dated years apart, some with stains where the ink had bled from moisture. When I showed them to my father, he closed his eyes. I wrote them after seeing your name in the papers. Every time I wanted to send one, I convinced myself you'd moved on, that hearing from me would only reopen things. It would have helped, I said. I know. He exhaled slowly, the sound rattling in his chest. You spent your life building things. Maybe I should have learned from you. Some things need to be built, not waited for. That afternoon the weather turned. Rain pressed against the windows, the kind that blurs everything outside until it looks like memory. My mother read aloud from a book while my father dozed. Her voice was softer than I remembered, careful, as if reading to the air itself might break it. When the chapter ended, she closed the book and looked at me. He's been waiting for this, having you here. He won't say it, but it's keeping him alive. I didn't know how to answer. Gratitude and guilt fought in my throat until both fell silent. Later, as evening settled, he stirred. Elias, he whispered, remember that wooden horse you made? I smiled faintly. The one you said had uneven legs? He nodded. It still does. But I kept it. It's in the attic. That single admission felt like a small light switching on somewhere deep in me. All this time I'd imagined my childhood thrown away. Instead, pieces of it had been preserved in dust. After midnight, I sat alone on the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving the scent of wet earth. The stars peeked through thin clouds like hesitant truths. I thought about everything we'd said, and everything we still hadn't. There were no perfect apologies, no tidy resolutions. Just moments of honesty stitched together by fatigue and time. For the first time, I didn't want perfection. I wanted presence. My mother joined me, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. He's asleep, she whispered. We sat there quietly, the boards beneath our feet still damp. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then silence returned. Do you think people can change? I asked. She hesitated. Maybe not completely, but they can choose to see what they missed before. Her answer felt true enough. When dawn came, light spilled across the fields, turning the wet grass silver. The world smelled clean, like forgiveness trying to begin again. I made breakfast, simple toast and eggs, the same meal my mother used to make when I was small. My father managed a few bites before setting the fork down. Good, he murmured. Better than I remember. The three of us ate together in silence. Not the old kind that wounded, but a new one that held possibility. For the first time, I realized silence could also mean peace. Later that day, I climbed to the attic. Dust motes floated through the sunlight that slipped between the boards. In the corner, wrapped in an old towel, I found it, the crooked wooden horse. Its paint had faded, one ear chipped, but it was still standing. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the rough edges my father had once criticized. Now they felt like proof that I'd been here, that something of me had survived. I carried it downstairs. When he saw it, his eyes lit briefly. There it is, he whispered. I was right to keep it. I set it on the mantel beside the old clock. It can stay there. He nodded, closing his eyes again, the faintest smile crossing his lips. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in years. I didn't write about regret or achievement or even forgiveness. I wrote about 3 people in a house at the edge of a field learning, slowly, quietly, that love can still find its voice, even if it arrives decades late. The morning the doctor came, the light through the kitchen window was pale and thin, the kind that made everything look fragile. I'd been up since dawn, making coffee that had gone cold twice over. The house was still except for the sound of my mother moving in the hallway and my father coughing softly in the next room. When the doctor left, his expression said everything words didn't. My mother stood at the door, one hand pressed to her chest, nodding without speaking. I didn't need to ask how long. You can read that kind of answer in the way someone avoids your eyes. In the days that followed, time moved strangely. Some hours lasted forever. Others vanished before I could catch my breath. I tried to stay busy, fixing the old gate, mending a leaking pipe, sanding down a cracked shelf. It wasn't about the tasks themselves. It was about control, about the illusion that if I kept my hands moving, I could hold back the inevitable. My mother watched me from the window sometimes, her face unreadable. "You always did that," she said once. "Did what?" "Worked when you were scared." I didn't argue. She was right. That afternoon, a neighbor dropped by, Mrs. Haver, a woman who'd known me since childhood. She brought a casserole and the kind of pitying smile people use when they don't know what else to offer. "You've done well for yourself, Elias," she said, looking around the house. "Your father was always proud, even if he never said it. You know men like him and stubborn, quiet types." I forced a smile. "Yeah, I know." As she left, she turned back and added softly, "He'll rest easier knowing you're here." The door closed behind her, and the house seemed to exhale, as though even the walls had been holding their breath. That night, as the wind rose outside and the fields whispered against the windows, my father called me into his room. He looked worse than before. Skin paper thin, breath shallow, eyes clouded but still sharp enough to see the truth. "Sit," he said. I did. He took a moment, his hand fumbling with the blanket. "You have a life in the city. People who depend on you. You should go back soon." The words hit me like a blow. "Go back?" he nodded. "There's nothing more you can do here. I don't want you stuck in this house the way I was." "You're my father," I said. "I'm not leaving you like this." His eyes softened. "You already gave me what I needed." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You came home." For a moment, I couldn't speak. He smiled faintly, a flicker of the man I used to fear and now could barely recognize. "You gave me peace. That's more than I deserve." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that peace wasn't something one person could give another, but I couldn't find the words. So I just sat there, listening to the wind rattle the windows, both of us pretending it wasn't the sound of time running out. After he fell asleep, my mother found me in the kitchen. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from years of holding too much in. "You can't stay forever, Eli," she said softly. "I know, but don't rush away either." I looked at her, surprised. She smiled sadly. "He needs to see you in the mornings. It reminds him he didn't fail. And you?" She hesitated. "I'll need to learn how to live in this house without both of you. That'll be my choice to make." Her honesty cut deeper than any grief. We stood there, 2 people who had learned how to speak only when life was almost done listening. That night, I dreamed I was a boy again, sitting on the floor of my father's workshop. He was carving something, his hands steady, his voice calm. "What are you making?" I asked. "A clock," he said, "but not the kind that tells time." "What does it do then?" "It remembers," he said, "for when we forget." When I woke, I was crying. Morning came quiet and gray. The wheat outside shimmered under the soft wind, and the house smelled faintly of rain. I walked into the living room. My father was awake, my mother beside him. He looked at me, really looked, and said, "You've built a good life. Don't let this place take it from you." I nodded, though my throat ached. "I'll stay until you're ready," I said. He smiled, the faintest curve of his lips. "Then I'm ready now." We both knew he wasn't, but I stayed anyway. Days turned to weeks. Some mornings he'd talk, others he'd just watch the window. My mother and I learned to move through the house in quiet rhythm. Tea, medicine, small talk, silence. Every now and then, he'd say something that sounded like goodbye, but I'd answer as if it were ordinary conversation. That's how we both pretended we still had time. He passed in his sleep on a Sunday. The sun rose gentle and gold, painting the room in warm light. His hand, cold but still curled loosely, rested on the blanket like he'd simply dozed off mid-thought. My mother stood beside me, one hand over her mouth, the other gripping my shoulder. We didn't cry right away. Grief has its own schedule. I sat with him for a long while, the clock ticking steadily, marking time not as an enemy but as a witness. After the funeral, I stood by the porch looking out at the fields. The wind moved through them the way memory moves through the heart, unseen but felt. The city waited for me. Clients, deadlines, a life half built on ambition and half on ache. But Meadow no longer felt like a place I had to escape. It felt like a story that finally had an ending. Imperfect, quiet, but real. I didn't know whether I'd stay another week or another year. Maybe I'd rebuild the old workshop. Maybe I'd sell the house. Maybe I'd just breathe for once without needing to prove I deserved to. That was my choice. Not escape, not obligation, just presence. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I placed the wooden horse on the porch railing.
Its uneven legs caught the light, casting two crooked shadows that merged into one. My mother joined me, her arm brushing mine.
We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of cedar and rain, the scent of home, both lost and found. For the first time, I understood that love isn't about erasing pain. It's about carrying it gently enough that it doesn't crush you. It has been 9 months since the funeral. Spring has come back to Meadow Ridge, tentative and green. The fields hum again with life, the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers and the faint sweetness of wet earth. The house still creaks in the mornings, but it's a gentler sound now, less like sorrow, more like memory settling into place. I wake early these days, not because of work but because of habit, that old rhythm of quiet before the world fully wakes. The kitchen feels different now, lighter. There's music sometimes. My mother hums while making tea. She started writing again, short essays for the local paper, reflections on small-town life. People love them. They say her words feel like home. I think they do, because they come from someone who's finally learned how to forgive herself. The biggest change, though, is out back. The workshop, my father's old one, is alive again. I rebuilt it board by board, sanding down the old cedar until the air smelled of sawdust and new beginnings. The walls are still crooked, the light still filters through the same cracks, but it feels different now. Kids from the town come here on weekends. I teach them simple carpentry, how to hold a chisel, how to listen to the grain of wood before cutting. They call it Mr. Winter's Maker's Club, though I never asked for the title. Sometimes when one of them laughs at their own uneven creation, I think of the crooked horse on the mantel. I think of how proud my father might have been to see this. Not the perfect cuts, but the joy in imperfection. There's something sacred about watching new hands learn to build. Maybe that's what he meant when he said some things need to be built, not waited for. Every Sunday I still write to him. The letters aren't mailed, of course. They sit in a box under my bed, next to the old ones he never sent me. I guess it's our way of keeping the conversation going. Sometimes I tell him about the workshop. Sometimes about my mother's new writing. Sometimes I just describe the weather, because small things matter now. One letter simply says, "I finally understand what you meant by staying doesn't have to mean being stuck." In late May, the town holds its spring festival. It's small, a few tents, music, local food. My mother convinces me to set up a booth with the kids from the workshop. We display their projects, birdhouses, picture frames, a few wooden toys. People stop to look, to ask questions, to smile. The air smells of popcorn and rain on dust. Then the sky darkens, clouds rolling in from the west. The first drops fall just as the band starts playing. People scatter, laughing, covering their heads, and for a moment it feels like chaos, but the music keeps going, and something inside me stirs. A wild, quiet joy. I step out from under the tent into the downpour. The kids follow, shrieking. My mother's laughter rings through the rain, bright and fearless. I close my eyes. The rain hits my face, cold and clean, washing away everything I'd carried too long, and in that moment, I swear I hear it, faint but clear, applause in the rain. Not from the crowd, not from the band, but from something deeper, from life itself. It feels like my father clapping in approval, not of what I've done, but of what I've become. When the rain eases, the world smells alive. We pack up the booth. My mother takes my arm as we walk home through the puddles. The sky is streaked with pink and gold, that strange color the world turns when it's forgiven the storm. She looks at me and says softly, "He'd be proud." I don't argue anymore. I believe her. Back home, the crooked wooden horse still stands on the mantel. The sunlight catches it just right, the imperfections glowing like they were carved there on purpose. I sit at the workbench, running my hands over the grain of new wood, breathing in the scent of sawdust and rain. The future doesn't feel like something distant anymore. It feels like something I can build, slowly, carefully, with my own hands. And maybe that's all I ever needed. Not applause from the world, not recognition from those who once forgot me, but the simple understanding that love and purpose aren't gifts you wait for. They're things you make. The evening settles around the house, warm and still. I light a lamp, open a fresh notebook, and begin to write. "Dear Dad, the workshop is finished. The kids built a clock today. Not the kind that tells time, but the kind that remembers." I pause, smiling. Outside, the rain starts again, gentle and steady, like the rhythm of a heart finally at rest. And for the first time in years, I don't feel the need to leave. I don't feel the weight of staying, I just feel home. I used to believe that love was a kind of applause, that if you worked hard enough, achieved enough, became enough, eventually someone would notice. Someone would clap. When I was younger, I measured my worth in moments of approval that never came. Every award, every headline, every success felt like a message I was mailing home to people who never opened the envelope. But the truth is, love doesn't always sound like applause. Sometimes it sounds like silence in the next room, the steady breathing of people who never learned how to say they care. Sometimes it looks like a man fixing a fence instead of saying, "I'm proud of you," or a mother making your favorite meal without meeting your eyes. I used to hate that silence. Now I understand it was the only language they knew. Grief has a strange way of translating what we once misunderstood. When someone's gone, you start hearing all the words they never said, hidden inside the ones they did. If you told me years ago that I would come back here, to this house, this small town, this field of ghosts, and find peace, I would have laughed. Peace to me was something that existed somewhere else, in bigger places, brighter rooms, far away from where pain began. But peace isn't found in distance. It's found in returning, not to the same life, but to the same truth, seen differently. When I rebuilt my father's workshop, I wasn't just repairing wood and hinges. I was rebuilding the bridge between who I was and who I became. Every plank, every nail, every speck of sawdust was a piece of understanding, a reminder that things don't need to be perfect to hold meaning. If you're reading this, whoever you are, maybe you felt that same ache. Maybe you've lived with the weight of being unseen. Maybe you've carried a silence that felt heavier than any insult could. Let me tell you something I learned too late, but not too late to share. You are not made smaller by being overlooked. You are not defined by who failed to see you. You are built quietly and steadily by the moments you choose to stay kind anyway. And one day, if you keep choosing love, not the fragile, asking kind, but the grounded, giving kind, you'll wake up and realize that you no longer need applause. Because you've become the sound itself. I still miss him. I still miss what could have been. But the missing doesn't hurt the same way now. It doesn't hollow me out. It fills me with gratitude. Because even the pain was proof that I cared enough to feel, and maybe that's all any of us really need, to care enough to feel. If my father could see me now, I think he'd smile. Not because I built a life he could be proud of, but because I finally built one I can be proud of. The rain outside has started again. It taps against the window steady and soft. It doesn't sound like sadness anymore. It sounds like memory, like rhythm, like love refusing to fade. And somewhere inside that sound I hear him, applauding.